So I think I was really moved by finally just reading the Bible for myself. Um, there are many people driving around with Darwin bumper stickers who've never cracked open a Bible. So I thought, well, I'll just read the book for myself because that's my line of work anyway. And it was hugely inconvenient because it actually really made a lot of sense.
The truth indeed is strong, Carol, and you will know when you are properly ravished by it.
This is a letter from the University of Oxford. It says I want a scholarship.
It's a full ride to Oxford.
We are not all-knowing, autonomous, or self-sufficient. We all bend the knee to something greater than ourselves.
Hi friends, it's Brittany Valadez for BravelyDaily.com. Well, if you guys haven't noticed, I am wearing a Biola University sweater because, of course, the school is super important to me. I can go on and on about it. And of course, this interview, I am interviewing author, and she is talking about her new film, Surprised by Oxford, which is based on the story of her life. Now, of course, we both went to theology schools. I had to wear mine, and of course, she went to Oxford. Even before we started talking, we were kind of geeking out over the university sweater because she says, Brittany, I know someone from Biola. I just was talking to him not too long ago. Like, I'm probably going to go out there. So we were kind of geeking out over that. So it's kind of cool. Yeah. But if you guys haven't already, make sure you're following me on social media. Of course, follow me on social media. I will put that in the description box below. I love to interact with you guys on social media. If you guys haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this channel. And you know what? Let's just get into the interview. First of all, can you tell us about this amazing movie that is based on a book about your life? Like, for any of us who aren't familiar with it, I mean, I am. I already saw the film. Tell us a little bit of your backstory, who you are and your backstory.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes, I grew up without a faith. Brittany, a lot like many others in North America, I would have described my family as loving enough to get by, but broken enough not to deserve God's attention. I had immigrant parents. I was the first one in my family to go to college. Really believed in learning and studying and applying myself and self-sufficiency. And my parents went through a hard time. My father lost his business and had a breakdown as a result. And my mom was a single mom raising us. And so really, by the time I went to study at Oxford as a graduate student, I was fairly I would have defined myself as agnostic. I couldn't disprove God, but I wasn't really going to trust in a father. My father was in and out of our lives at that point, and I couldn't trust on him being involved. And so I would have defined myself as really self-reliant, a really strong and committed student. And I thought that knowledge was power and the answer to everything. And that's why I was going to go pursue my doctorate. So that's how I arrived there. And actually, I was very surprised, I think, as the title conveys, hopefully, and also echoes someone like C.S. Lewis, because I was surprised by God there.
So I know that I've heard this before, that a lot of people will say that you see God based on your father. Is that something that, with your father being in and out, that maybe you saw God as somebody who was just like not even there? Or how did that lack of a father figure in your life make you perceive God?
Well, it's interesting because I think it was Freud who said we can always be sure of our mothers, we can never be sure of our fathers, right? And the great archetype, the great monomyth of the journey of the father, questing to know the father, right? We see that in everything from Odysseus to Darth Vader. So I think there's something deep in us that longs to be known by our fathers and seeks their blessing and our full identity in that, however, whatever shape that takes, in so many different walks or religions or stories. But I did a minor in psych, and I remember reading about that, the idea that we construct in some ways our spiritual notions of fathers based on our earthly ones, which I guess would make sense. And so I had a concept of God in many ways as just probably pretty fair weather, sort of showing up when he wants to, not being dependable, maybe not really being steadfast, being fascinating and turbulent and mighty, but also really inconsistent and unreliable. And I think that does feed, perhaps for some people, especially when coupled with a father wound, might feed the ways that we construct of an eternal father. That would make sense. Maybe not for all, but I think for many, and that was certainly my case.
I love the movie for all the aspects of theology, of just beautiful England, studying, and then of course the love story aspect. Can you tell us a little bit about your love story? And I'm not even kidding. I loved the contrast of your personality with your now husband in the film. I loved everything about it.
Oh, I'm so glad. Or this could be more awkward, but even then it would still be a fodder for good conversation. Yeah, I mean, when we met, actually in the book, it's not conveyed as much in the film, but I was actually engaged to someone else. So who was not a Christian at the time. But when I met my husband, he was one of the first people to really clearly articulate the gospel to me, Brittany, which I think a lot of people take for granted. Christians might realize that other people just, especially in mainstream society, don't really know the gospel, haven't heard it clearly, or the concepts of Jesus, or, certainly a personal relationship with Jesus is really an alien thing. And it comes through the media, or it comes through, mitigated sources. And there can be a lot of cynicism or skepticism or hesitancy around that, and rightly so. So it was really interesting to meet Christians who were just great people. They walked their talk. They were not perfect by any means, but they were real. They engaged in the real. They met me there. He was one of those. We were not romantically involved for a long time. We were just friends for actually quite some time, which I also think was a real gift, especially in retrospect. It gave me a chance to kind of think through my faith. And of course, I cared for him deeply, but it circled back more seriously later when we had our own lives. So I think that the love story is certainly part of the film, but there's a much bigger love story it's part of.
There's a lot of things that I want to unpack with your answers. So I guess we'll break them down because I really love it. So first we'll go with you were engaged to someone else. What caused you to end that engagement? Was it your faith in Christ or this new person in your life? I mean, why did that end? And then what made you actually find your now husband attractive, like going from friends to, I want to marry you?
Big questions. Well, I think as I accepted the Christian faith and was growing more in it, and I was in relationship with somebody who was very, very kind and respectful, but didn't want to have that aspect in life, I realized for me, at least, that I really grappled with being unequally yoked and what Scripture says about that. And of course, the temptation to just say, okay, will just work itself out. This will be fine. But I think going into marriage, knowing that you're on such different footing, or you're bringing such different worldviews into it, is a whole different game and recipe for disaster than it is having something change later along the line. And I felt it was really important for us to be able to share our faith. And so that was the reason we just were in different directions. And so I felt that it was important to change that course for myself. And so it was really, as I said before, I think over a course of a few years in which my friendship with Kent grew and deepened, we had stayed in touch, but we had gone different paths for a while. And so during that time, I always cared for him, and I was always really moved by his example in my life, but I thought I might never see him again either. He was off doing things in Washington, D.C., and I was staying in England and working and doing my doctorate there and teaching and whatnot. And so it sort of grew later, after I had a chance as well to have my own church and other Christian friends and grow my faith apart from just his example, which I think is important regardless whether we're single or married or engaged or whatever, right? Our hearts have to be Christ's first. We're married to him first if we're Christians, regardless of our status, our earthly status. And that's really the most important relationship. It's the first commandment for a reason.
Everything you said is going to ring so true for so many people. It's true in general. It's just truth. But for some people, it's going to touch them deeply because maybe they're going through something like that right now. So I love that you were vulnerable and shared that story. So thank you. Something else you said, you mentioned the gospel, how a lot of us assume that people know, especially if we've been raised in the faith all our lives. I know for me personally, what I've been focusing on a lot in my current season of life is going back to the basics of the gospel, because we just hear that word, that phrase so many times. We're just like, gospel, gospel, Jesus died, rose again. It becomes almost just like a thing. But if we sit down and unpack it, you would be, I guess people would be so surprised how many people don't actually know, especially because America is considered, like the US or even just the West in general, that Christianity is like known, and then of course like Catholicism, and there's so many people that are kind of nominal in both faiths, that if we were to ask anybody, what is the gospel, do you know what it is, people actually don't. So can you tell us the importance, number one, of the gospel and how to practically share it in, in today's society?
Well, it's very discerning of you to say all of that. William Drummond said very famously, never give anyone a thimbleful of gospel, give them the whole thing. And I think when you don't grow up with a faith or with a very real faith, right, it can seem similarly canned. I mean, I think that's what's so troubling about the truth, what's so tricky. And I think your idea of trying to get back to the truth and Jesus as the center of that, and the scriptural truth, and pulling away all the threads of culturalese, both Christian culturalese and secular culturalese, right, to get to that heart of it. If you grow up without that frame of reference, it can sound canned and cheesy. And if you're growing up within it, it can be worn out, right? It's like, oh, it's like Shakespeare in a sense, and you forget how beautiful it is. And I really believe in those ideas that those truths bear repeating, much like like Tolkien says, the truths that lie too deep for frost. There's this going back to really how powerful those truths are. If we actually really sat with those, we would be blown away. We actually can't sit with them. We're too finite. And so we're given these glimpses of mystery, but they're so incredibly powerful. And so the ways that we have to be very, very careful and discerning in our own hearts as Christians too, about this incredible power that we have access to, that deserves both fear and reverence, and our full attention.
Absolutely. And I know I want to go a little bit into your background as far as what you've studied, because obviously you're a well-spoken person, and I mean, you know your stuff, and that's why I like talking to you.
Well, that's very gracious. I'm glad you tip that way.
Like intellectual
I'm sure
people.
there are many that would beg to differ, including my own teenage children, but there you go.
Oh gosh, as they get older, they'll start respecting you even so much more. The teenage years.
Oh, well, Brittany, that gives me hope, because right now I'm just very uncool.
No. You'll do so much better in a couple of years, I promise, to them in their eyes. Coming from a person who just didn't really believe in God at all or anything, what was it about, I guess maybe the apologetic side or anything that drew you to faith? Because a lot of times people think that faith is for the weak-minded, for the people who are living in make-believe. Faith and science don't go together. All of these lies that both you and I know are not true. But what was that transition, and what advice would you give to someone who is saying, I'm more on the intellectual path right now? Faith stuff just seems for people, like the average Joe.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was entirely where I came from. I get that. I thought that faith and intellect were absolutely antithetical. They couldn't be held together. That it was ridiculous to think of a thoughtful person as having faith, which is really interesting though, because it was, there is a long, incredibly powerful Christian intellectual history. And also the idea that intellect can only get us so far, right? It can't do everything. And so I think I was really moved by finally just reading the Bible for myself. There are many people driving around with Darwin bumper stickers who've never cracked open a Bible. So I thought, well, I'll just read the book for myself, because that's my line of work anyway. And it was hugely inconvenient, because it actually really made a lot of sense. I remember getting to the end of Genesis and thinking, oh my goodness, no matter if you take this literally, metaphorically, however you interpret it, 7 days of creation, whatever you want to do, right? That mere Christianity idea of the essence, the truth at the heart of Genesis was really compelling, that our world is post-lapsarian, our world is fallen, our world is broken. That's something we can't deny. And it's broken because of our choice of self over other. our preference for self over God. And if God is love personified in the spiritual, then our turning to fear instead of love, our turning to self-referential and self-referencing instead of other, serving other, loving other, really made a lot of sense. And I wasn't prepared for that. The idea that when Adam and Eve eat and of the forbidden fruit, and the ways that we can read consumerism and our consumption of others for our own benefit, all of those ways we can read that, was really powerful for me, that God didn't go anywhere, we did, and as I continued to read into the Bible for myself, all the way through to Revelation, just as a book, you couldn't make this stuff up. The thread all the way through of the larger picture of redemption and repairing that broken relationship, but also the smaller stories in between in there that are just like all of our stories. There's something for everyone in there. And so all of our stories are within that larger one. And that was really inconvenient, but also really mind-blowing. And also, I mean, as I began to read and think in that a lot more for myself, that science and things like that didn't necessarily disprove faith, and that there's a whole tradition in which you can think a feeling and feel a thought too. So these ways that we're actually prejudging even the notions of faith or thinking spiritually, that we are spiritual thinkers. What happens if we actually sit and roll that notion around, as opposed to dismissing it immediately or responding out of fear?
Everything that you said, I try to get across to my audience. Most of my audience are Christian, and I'm encouraging them, just read your Bible. It took me years to finally read it from cover to cover. It was something that I, as a Christian, having been born in the faith basically since I was a child, thought I could never do in my own life. I thought, well, by the time I die, I will have never read the Bible once. No, I finally did. And I will say the Bible, the gospel, which is the whole Bible itself, it offends, it confronts, awakens you.
It does. There's nothing else like it.
Yeah, you will not be changed until you read it for yourself, not just listening to someone, but reading it for yourself. So, thank you so much for your insight. I really appreciate it. And I know it's going to encourage so many people like it did to me. So just have one last thing before we hop off. Surprised by Oxford is a fantastic movie. So just take the floor, promote it.
Well, I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. I think that the film team did a beautiful job. Ryan Whitaker did the screenplay adaptation from the book No Easy Feat. It's a long book. He's a very talented writer, and I think he has a very gentle spirit as well. Really wants to invite people to God's table in a way that welcomes all people of all stripes, asking all different types of questions, whether from a place of faith or not. And I think he did a lovely invitational job with that. The musical score is gorgeous. Nick Fox's music is gorgeous. And so it settles with you as you leave the theater. The actors, so wonderful and talented. I'm really grateful, the cinematography, for how it brings you out of yourself. And you feel like you've gone on this mini vacation, but it also, I hope, encourages people to leave the theater to ask the questions that really matter, and to sit and have conversations with each other as well in fellowship, in the really real, in the true, the things that are not just culturally worn out even by well-intended Christians, but that they would actually go back to the truth as it really gleams and shines true.
Friends, thank you so much for hanging out with me for this interview with Carolyn. It's been fantastic. I enjoyed it so much. I love talking all things theology, the gospel, and anything related to the Bible with her, because the gospel changes. It changed me. It helped me mature in ways that I would have never seen. So yeah, that was a fantastic conversation. Until next time, I'm Brittany Valadez for BravelyDaily.com. God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.